Welcome. I am very excited to have Dr. Annette Perot joining us today. Annette is a specialist in OCD and anxiety and all of the wonderful OCD-related disorders, including hoarding disorder. She has been doing this for a while, and she has a particular interest in hoarding. She's been part of a task force around hoarding in North Carolina. She has a number of lovely accomplishments and accolades. Uh, I'm going to skip over some of them and just add the ones that I think are the most important, which is just that Annette and Jeff Zapata, who is also here, started the state affiliate of the IOCDF here in North Carolina. And when I moved to North Carolina, uh, they were some of the first people that I reached out to in connecting with the OCD community. And the thing that really struck me was just how welcoming they were. You know, I think there are some industries and some places where people are very territorial and it's a competitive kind of thing. Uh, and there was none of that, which I think speaks very highly to Annette. And I mention it here just because I think it is relevant to her dedication to the OCD community, right? Like that her seeing a new OCD therapist in North Carolina is not, oh no, there's competition. It's great. There are more folks out here to help people with OCD in North Carolina. So I just want to applaud not just Annette's accomplishments, but what a lovely human being she is.
Oh,
What an asset to the OCD community. And she's also showing up today feeling a bit under the weather, which is, again speaks to her dedication. So thank you, Annette.
you're
Really appreciate you
welcome.
doing this. And I will turn it over to you to tell us all about hoarding.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Ben. That is so kind. And um, I mean, I try to live into what you said about me. I think it also says so much about the OCD community. And I just can't say enough things about being involved in IOCDF and in OCD North Carolina. And I think in general, this is the experience that people have is of people being welcoming. And so um I will hold off all the other wonderful things that I can say about that, but because we have a lot of things to get to. Some of you who are here may have lived experience with hoarding or with having difficulty, in how you relate to possessions, regardless of whether or not um, you've ever been diagnosed with hoarding disorder or whether or not you think that that entirely fits. Some of you may have a loved one who you're concerned about in terms of their relationship with possessions. And some of you may be therapists in the area who are wanting to learn a little bit more about this issue. Whatever it is that brought you here tonight, I'm so glad that you're here and, hope that you will find this valuable. So, what is hoarding disorder? We just got started and I would like to take a little bit of a quiz. I didn't set it up as a quiz, but if people want to put in the chat, I'm going to show you an image in a moment that's going to have 9 pictures. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pick the number that represents the level of clutter that might, represent hoarding disorder. And so if people could look at those pictures and just put in the chat what you think the number is where that level of clutter might suggest hoarding disorder. And Ben, do you have a sense? Are you able to see the chat?
I am.
It's too hard for me to like look at the slides and the chat at the same time.
Yeah, we had a couple folks who were brave and actually both agreed. We have a couple of 5s, we have a 6 and beyond, we have
Okay.
another 6. There are
Mhm.
some question marks after these
Okay.
numbers
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
well.
I should have said if anyone's been to one of my talks before, you cannot you cannot chime in. But So um, for anybody who was thinking that it might have been a 4, you would be correct. That really the transition from 3 to 4, then we would be thinking this might be a situation in terms of hoarding disorder. One of the things that, there are have been lots of different TV shows about hoarding, and some of you may have seen some of those. And, on the one hand, I like the fact that those shows brought a lot of awareness about this issue to our attention. At the same time, there are a variety of things that I think have been, not so great about some of the shows. I won't go into all of that, but one of the things that has not been so great is that they've tended to show more extreme examples. And so you're seeing like 8s and 9s in a lot of these homes. And I think that gives people this false impression that that's what hoarding disorder is, and that anything short of that really it wouldn't rise to that level. And those are really the most severe, levels of clutter that we're talking about with hoarding. But hoarding, really, people would get a diagnosis much sooner than that. And it's really important that we appreciate that, because it's important to try to be identifying a hoarding situation sooner so that somebody can get help sooner. Those images come from an assessment instrument that we use called the clutter image rating. And that here's the reference for it. But and one of the things we're going to be talking about is clutter is really only a piece of this, but it does help everybody be on the same page in terms of, we can use terms like, I have a lot of clutter, or I don't have very much. It's like, well, what does that mean? And so, this is part of why it was created, is to really help people have a better sense of kind of, what level of clutter we're talking about. In terms of hoarding disorder, what we're talking about is when somebody has difficulty parting with possessions due to a perceived need to save items, or experiencing distress regarding parting with possessions in such a way that it results in clutter in the living areas, such that that space is difficult to use for its intended purpose. And it would cause either significant distress or difficulty, doing daily activities, things like bathing, preparing food, things like that. When I highlighted living areas, my mother-in-law knows that I, work with hoarding disorder, and she teases me and, well, actually, she has never let me go into her attic, and she teases me and says, it's like, if I let you in my attic, you're going to diagnose me with hoarding disorder. Now, I've been to her home many times. It would be fine if she did have hoarding disorder, but she does not. I've seen the living areas of her home, and, there is not a level of clutter that's interfering in other parts of her house, even if her attic, I don't know, but, her attic may be really congested. Quite often when somebody does have hoarding disorder, other areas like an attic or a basement, or sometimes people's yard or their cars or things like that, might also be congested with possessions. But to get the diagnosis, somebody would need to have it be in the living areas. It can involve significant acquiring. It doesn't have to get a diagnosis of hoarding disorder. However, in reality, about 90% of the people that have hoarding disorder have, at least at some point, had significant acquiring. And so, you pretty much would have to have a significant acquiring at some point. But for some people, they no longer do. It was at an earlier point, and now that part has really dropped off, but the difficulty parting with things has remained. And so the level of clutter in the home has also remained. And in terms of acquiring, actually, let me go back. In terms of acquiring, it might be getting things at retail stores or thrift stores or yard sales. It might also be getting things for free. The state fair is going to be starting on Thursday. And so I think about the different booths that they have where you can pick up free things, a stress ball or pens or things like that. And So, a lot of times people will acquire things that way, or they might get like buy one, get one free of something. And it's like hard to pass up, getting free things, even if it's not necessarily what you need. People might also passively acquire. And so they might get things that come into their possession without them seeking that out. So catalogs, junk mail, things like that would fall into that category. We also find, sorry for my cough drop, like Ben was saying, I'm a little under the weather, so hopefully that won't be distracting. But we found hoarding behavior and clutter occurring in other conditions too. And these are some examples of that. A good example is in depression. Sometimes when somebody's depressed, they might not have the energy or motivation to be putting things away. And so things might end up resulting in clutter in their living space. It's not usually to the level that we would see with hoarding. But in addition, it's really going to be for that reason, not so much difficulty parting with things. Um, and so it's really important to be recognizing there may be some behaviors that are part of something else. It's why it's really important to do a more thorough assessment, or refer somebody for an assessment to see, is this what we're talking about, or is this really part of something else? Because it isn't always due to hoarding disorder. About 2 to 6% of the population, it's estimated, has hoarding disorder. And that most of the research that's been done, unfortunately, has been done in the United States or in Western European countries, but there has been research that's been done in some other places as well, and that's becoming more and more the case. And they're finding that it's pretty similar in terms of the occurrence rate across different parts of the world. The kinds of reasons for why people hoard is also pretty similar, although the kinds of things that people might save might be a little bit different depending on kind of where somebody is geographically. Um, it often begins in early adolescence, and then it tends to get worse over each decade of life. It does not tend to get better without some kind of intervention, whether that's somebody in therapy or a peer-led, buried in treasures group, or some self-help working on this. But without some type of addressing of it, it does not tend to improve on its own. There's kind of really two bumps that occur, one in early adolescence and then one in the 30s, where there's an uptick in the occurrence of hoarding. And then in somebody's 50s is oftentimes when people are presenting for treatment, if they're going to present for treatment. Um, and then it tends to run in families. And that's not just in terms of the environment. There's certainly probably some environmental factors that contribute, but in addition, we do believe that there are some that there's a genetic component to this that leads some people to be more predisposed. It tends to occur equally in males and females. Some studies have found that it occurs a little, more in males, but most of the research has indicated pretty even between them, and often co-occurs with other issues, which can make it more challenging in terms of addressing this issue. Um, the most common issue that co-occurs with hoarding is major depressive disorder, which really can make it tricky because, sort of like I was giving an example previously about depression, some people might only have depression and they might have some clutter because of that. Some people might have hoarding disorder, and then some people might have both. And if you have both, you could, makes it all the clearer why it is that somebody might have difficulty with this, because you've got two things that really would make it hard to be keeping your living space in maybe in the kind of way you would want. In addition, social anxiety and ADHD, the inattentive type of ADHD, I'm sorry, the ADHD, the inattentive type, occurs in about 30%. And then social anxiety and GAD both occur about 24%. So you see a high rate of anxiety-related issues that co-occur with hoarding. We used to think that hoarding was a subset of OCD. And one of the things that we have found over time is that that's really not the case. The co-occurrence is about 20%. The majority of people that have hoarding do not have OCD, and the majority of people who have OCD don't have hoarding disorder, but there's certainly some overlap. But what kind of contributes to it is very different. The type of treatments that have been found to be effective and medications are very different. And so it's really good that we've discovered that over time as a field so that we can be working on, more effective treatments. And while the treatments that we have been found to be effective, we really need to be, making them better because they are not as effective as we would like for them to be. So let's talk a little bit about what does contribute to hoarding. It's a variety of factors, and I tend to think about this as a bit of an iceberg, where the part that gets a lot of the attention tends to be, what occurs that you can see above the surface, the clutter. And certainly the clutter is important because that can really impact people's functioning in their life. But if we only focus on that, we're really going to be missing the parts that are really the most important to be addressing. We certainly know this, that when people do, mass cleanouts, and luckily we've learned, communities have learned that does not work for a variety of reasons. That all that typically happens is that the same patterns exist. And so in no time, the home is back to being cluttered again. To say nothing of the fact that it's incredibly distressing for people that have hoarding issues, and also like really disrespectful. It's to be reserved for there are times where it absolutely has to happen, and then you really want to work hard to try to do that in a way that's going to be most supportive of the person who is living in that space and is dealing with these issues as much as possible. So some of the issues that are beneath the surfaces, which is really where the action is, one is about vulnerability factors, things like family history of hoarding, like I was saying earlier, other mental health issues that would lead somebody to be more vulnerable, family values, beliefs, behaviors regarding possessions. That's the kind of environmental factors that can play a role. I think about the adage, want not, waste not, want not. And so it's like you grow up hearing certain messages about the importance in saving various things for various reasons, and we internalize those. In addition, to like some historical factors, some current factors too, like how much space does the person have? How much time do they have to be, working on these issues? Or do they have health-related problems? It doesn't mean that those things are going to cause this issue, but if somebody has a predisposition already, and then they have some of these factors, that combination may lead things to develop or get exacerbated. And one of the biggest factors that's a vulnerability factor are stressful life events or traumas. People who have a history of trauma, in particular earlier in life, are significantly more likely to develop hoarding disorder than people who do not, which also is an important factor in terms of not only it being important for people to be developing, to be getting help in terms of the traumatic experiences that they've had, but also in terms of the hoarding. And then also makes it important for people who do have if for anybody in the room today who's a therapist, to be looking to potentially do a screen for hoarding for anybody who has a history in terms of trauma. And then another factor that contributes to the development is what we refer to as information processing issues. And so we're talking about things like attention. Somebody tend to get distracted or being over-focused. Earlier, when I was saying the inattentive part of ADHD, this is what we're referring to, a lot of the executive functioning skills. difficulty with categorizing things, difficulty with decision making, a tendency to over rely on visual cues. So keeping things out so you can see them and in order to remember. And then what we refer to as associative or complex thinking. Um, People who have hoarding disorder oftentimes are incredibly creative, resourceful people. They can think of lots of different uses for something. And so, I have here the lid to a milk jug. And somebody who does not have hoarding issues might, you know, after finishing the milk, might decide, okay, I'm done with that. I'll either throw this away or I'll put it in recycling. Somebody who has hoarding issues might say, well, gosh, I could use that. It could be a cat toy, or I could put some glue in there. I do a lot of crafts, and I could put glue in there and use that when I'm working on craft projects. Or, oh, I could put like my morning pills in there. Um, the more uses that we can think of for something, it's going to feel far more valuable and important for us to hang on to it. Um, so that's another piece of what can contribute to this. And then another area that can contribute to hoarding are the meaning of possessions that we hold. The people who have hoarding issues save things for the same reasons as people who don't have hoarding issues. Um, it's more an issue of the degree to which that occurs with more items, and where it's more rigid or fixed in place. And so somebody might save for sentimental reasons, who does not have hoarding issues. And then, it's like if they're looking around their space and they're running out of room, they might then kind of decide, all right, certain ones I'm going to save and certain things I'm not going to save. Somebody who has issues with hoarding, how much space they have might not end up factoring in, that they feel like they have to save it regardless of the fact that it's taking up more and more space. And so when we talk about the meaning of possessions, it can be things like sentimental reasons, like getting rid of the cards that people give me would mean that they don't matter to me, or issues about responsibility or waste. Getting rid of it would mean wasting a valuable opportunity, or I should save it for somebody who might want it. Or it could be about memory. And when we talk about memory, we're not talking about actual memory. So people who have hoarding issues don't tend to have any greater, cognitive functioning issues than people who don't have hoarding issues. But it's their perception about memory in a sense that I need to hang on to something and keep it out, where I can see it, or I'm going to forget about it. I'm going to forget about an experience, so I need to keep the thing so I could look at it, or I need to keep it out so I'm, going to remember to do it or remember where it is. It can also be messages about the utility or uniqueness of items. If I get rid of it, I might need it and I won't have it, or I won't be able to find another one that's just like it. And then there are emotional reactions. Now, we all have lots of different emotions. We do know that we've kind of learned over time that people who have difficulty with hoarding can tend to have more difficulty with emotion regulation, and so might have stronger emotions about things, unpleasant emotions in particular, and difficulty kind of regulating those emotions. And, it can be various pleasant and unpleasant emotions that play a role in terms of hoarding. It might be things like somebody is upset about something, and so then they go and they acquire possessions because that feels good and it helps them to not feel bad. It can also be that they hold on to things versus parting with things because parting with things brings up unpleasant feelings, a feeling of loss, or sorrow, grief, and so they avoid parting with things in order to avoid those unpleasant emotions. And so, really, what we're talking about is we're talking about not very adaptive or functional ways of managing unpleasant and pleasant emotions. And so it's understandable how it is that people are all of us try to avoid unpleasant emotions probably more than we should. And that difficulty with being with unpleasant emotions can end up playing a role in all of this. And then reinforcement patterns, it's like negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement. For anyone who remembers from, if you've ever taken like a Psych 101 class or a psychology class, some high schools have them, or in college, that yeah, we get reinforced over and over again. So we do it a certain way and that reinforces it. And then we do it that way again and over and over and over again. And then as that gets reinforced, there's more acquiring, more saving. And then that results in more clutter. And so hopefully people are seeing that, when we think about all of these things that are beneath the surface that we don't see, hopefully it's all the clearer how it is that things would result in clutter, and quite often in a not very organized way, for people that have difficulty in terms of hoarding. And it doesn't mean that each of us, it doesn't mean that we don't have to then, figure out what are we going to do about that. But it's also understandable how it is that all of this occurs. So, you know, you may be wondering, for those of you who have lived experience who are here tonight, you might be wondering, like, okay, so how can I work on this? And certainly I want to strongly encourage that people who are concerned about whether or not they have difficulty with how they relate to possessions and the possibility of hoarding issues, it may be helpful to meet with a mental health professional to get a diagnosis and make sure you're addressing this in the right, in a way that's going to be most helpful. For some people, they may not decide to be in treatment. There's a really good self-help book that's going to be on one of the last slides, just so people can, that you can refer to it there too. And it's Buried in Treasures. The second edition of this, it's by Dave Tolan, Randy Frost, and Gail Steckety. And there are also Buried in Treasures workshops that are in different places in the country. Unfortunately, I don't know of any that are in North Carolina. I'm actually have been trying to get into the training to get trained to offer those. And you would think it would be easier to do that. And we definitely need to make it a little bit easier for providers to get trained in that. And not just providers, but it's set up, Buried in Treasures workshop, so that people do not have to be mental health professionals. One of the beauties of it is that they're oftentimes peer led, but they can also be led by a mental health professional. So, but we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that you can work on this. One, I'm going to have us do a little exercise and practice in categorizing or in organizing. So what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to show you an image of a variety of different items. And I want you to be thinking about, like, the item, what category you might put it in, and then what location you might put it in your home. Now, it might be like where you already have things, but if not, like where would make sense to you to put them. And everybody's answer is not going to be identical because we all have different living spaces, and what makes sense to one person isn't going to be the thing that makes sense or is most functional for someone else. If you look at these different items and just take a minute to think about, like, what category you would put different ones in, and then where they might go in your living space. And for some people are super good at thinking about this kind of thing. Some of the people who are professional organizers are really good at this kind of stuff. And then, people who have difficulty with ADHD or difficulty with hoarding, it might not be as easy to think about how you would categorize and organize your possessions. And so if anybody wants to write in the chat an example of what category you would put one of the items in and where it would go in your home. And Ben, if anybody makes a comment, if you want to share it.
So we have some of the utilities. So I'm thinking ruler, that kind of thing, and a
Mhm,
hardware drawer, tape and glue, whisk could go in the kitchen drawer.
mhm. Yeah, and see, this is a
Yeah.
really good example of how we do things differently. There's not one right answer because these are actually my possessions, but but so the ruler, I have rulers in my home would typically be either with my craft supplies or they would be in my they would be there and they would be in my office supplies.
So
So it just depends what you use them for.
I was just thinking like these are clearly Annette's, and I'm wondering, is the whisk for crafts? Or like, yeah, like how many of these things are for crafts? I'm not sure.
Yeah, the whisk actually is in the kitchen, actually set for cooking. Um, yeah, you can I won't go into like how many back issues of the monitor or I have a tendency to keep a lot of paper materials. I can relate to the people that I work with who have hoarding issues. And I am constantly being told by my spouse, you can find those online. So I have to remind myself of that. And so this is an example, and it's just an example, like we were talking about. People will keep them in different places, but of kind of how somebody might categorize and put things. And so that's one of the things that we work on with people is around strengthening some of the skills. Like if we're talking about that as being an area, some of the um, deficits in some areas for people that have hoarding, then one of the ways we work on that is to be strengthening people's ability to be categorizing and organizing their possessions, figuring out where things are going to go. It's not the only thing, obviously, that we're going to work on, but there are a lot of skill building things. And then we're also going to be working on helping people to be making decisions as they're going along around, am I going to keep something? Am I going to part with it? If I'm keeping it, like we were saying, determining the category, sorting it, moving it to its final location, or if it can't be in the final location, in an interim location. So, if somebody has a lot of clutter that's making it hard to get into their closet, then it may be that clothing that's going to eventually go into the closet may temporarily have to be in a bin or a box, but we want to label it so that you know everything that's in there are the things that are going to go in the closet. And then the things that you decide, okay, these are things that I am not going to be keeping, that you have to further decide of those things. Are there any that are going to go in the trash? Are there any that are going to go in recycling? Am I going to sell any? You don't want to sell too many things because that takes a lot of time. Only you get to decide how many things that you're going to sell. But you want to be weighing how much time will it take to do that? And how much time do I have to give it? Is that how I want to be using my time so that you're not picking a number of things to sell that's more than the time you really have to give to it? And then are there things that you're going to be donating? Where will those go? And when you're going to be working on sorting things in terms of your possessions, to be having some containers, boxes, or bins that are labeled in terms of these are things that are donations. What can sometimes happen is people will go through and they'll try to be sorting some things and then they don't act on it. So they don't put them in a bin and then take those to the place where they're making donations. And then they sit there. And then if they didn't label the bin, then other things get put in there. And suddenly they have to like start from scratch all over again. And so we really, work with people around how to do this in a more methodical, organized way. And sometimes somebody might, in addition to working with a therapist like myself, they might also be working with a professional organizer to be learning some of these skills. I do some of this myself with clients, but sometimes a professional organizer might do that too. And there are professional organizers who specifically have training in hoarding and so have an understanding and a compassion around these issues. One of the issues that comes up a lot for people with hoarding is around attention, like we were talking about, and energy and mood, particularly if we're looking at, a high percentage of people also having depression. And so it's really helpful to be, doing some things to kind of adjust to the fact that that's the case. So it can be helpful to schedule sorting appointments, like specific times when you're going to be working on sorting and decision making about possessions. Um, and also, it can be helpful to enlist the help of a coach or a helper. It could be a family member, as long as that person is able to be more empathic and compassionate around this. If you butt heads with a certain family member, that's probably not the person that you want to turn to help you for this. Or, they're probably going to want to need to be working with somebody to address some of the frustration and anger that they're having first, so that they can better be able to help you. Um, and then also really working up to being able to sort and work on, decision making about possessions for a greater amount of time. If you notice that you have a hard time focusing your attention for more than maybe 15 minutes, that's okay. Then you just want to start with 15 minutes and set your timer, work on it for 15 minutes. And then, after doing that for a few days, then you might set the timer for 20 minutes and then 25. So you're going to be strengthening, sort of like working out at the gym. And you might initially only be able to lift 10 pounds, and that's okay. You start wherever you are. And then you gradually, as you get stronger, you can add more from there. It's also helpful to think about, like, what's a particularly good time of day when you know that you have more energy or more ability to focus. And so, if you know that you really can't focus your attention, or you have low motivation later in the day, don't try to be sorting possessions then, because you're just kind of setting yourself up. And you don't need that. It can also be really helpful to make it more enjoyable, but you just don't want to have it be too distracting. And so if somebody likes listening to music, they might put music on, especially something that's a little more peppy or energetic. I've worked with some people where they will put a show on that they've seen a lot, or a movie on that they've seen so many times that they don't really need to be paying close attention. But they like having it on because they feel like they're not bored if it's on. And then in addition, really you want to focus on narrowing things down. It's easy to feel really overwhelmed looking at all of the possessions that you're trying to work on. And it's really helpful to narrow it down to what room do I want to start with? And then in addition to that room, what section of that room? And then even breaking it down further, like, okay, this surface in that section of that room, I'm going to work there. Um, if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed or distracted by all the other things aside from the area you're working on, it can be helpful to be putting like a sheet over other, other items in the room, so that you're only seeing and focusing on the part that you're working on. Whatever it is that you need to do in order to break it down into smaller steps, so that it feels a little more manageable. Um, Now, one of the things that, depending on how much clutter there is in somebody's home, one of the things that can be really difficult is figuring out a place to be sorting items. And so, if you don't have a place that's clear at the moment where you'd be able to sort items, then you want to think about where would be a place that would be most conducive to sorting, and then work on sorting things in that area first, so that you can have an area clear to be able to work in. It'll be your like staging area. And if you have a table, like a card table or something that you could put there, great. If you don't, you could work on the floor. That's totally fine. But what you want to do is, when you've worked on sorting for block of time, then you want to have things get put back. And so it would be either things get put away or they're in an interim location like a bin or a box, and that you're going to have that area be clear so that it'll be ready for the next time that you're going to be working on sorting. And then really helpful to be rewarding yourself. This is really hard work. It is not particularly fun, for anybody, I don't think. And so you want to be able to do something that's enjoyable afterward. For some people, I've worked with some people where they really have loved spending time with their grandkids, for example, and they would set it up so that after a sorting session, they would have time where they could go do something fun with their grandkids. So they really looked forward to that as the reward for the hard work they were putting in. It can, when we're talking about sorting, some of the things that are helpful to do in working on making the decisions about do I keep something or do I part with something would be to ask yourself some different questions. Quite often, what happens for people that have difficulty with hoarding is that they're asking a very narrow set of questions. So they might be just asking themselves, do I like it? Or, is it something that I might use at some point? And the answer might be yes. And it could very well be true that they like it or that they might use it at some point. And that the issue is really that they need to be asking a broader number of questions. And these are some examples of other questions that can be helpful to take into consideration. Things like, how many do I currently have? How many would seem like it's enough? Like sometimes people will say, well, what if something happens, to the one that I have? And then I might want to have a backup. It's like, okay, like how many backups do you think one, would be useful for somebody to have? Or this question about, do I have enough time to use, review, or read it? Like I've worked with people where they'll save a lot of newspapers, for example, or magazines, because someday, like they might want to read that, and so they would want to hang on to it in case they do want to read it. And that's fine. Only you are the only one that gets to make these decisions about what possessions you keep or part with. Therapy is not for the therapist to tell you what things to keep or what things to part with. However, I feel like my job and the job of other therapists who work with people with hoarding issues is to help you to be strengthening your skills in various ways in order to help you make decisions that work more effectively for you in your life. And so some questions you might ask are like, how many magazines or newspapers do I currently have? How long does it typically take for me to read one? Times how many I have. Do I want to give that amount of time to reading magazines? And if the answer is no, not really, then that might help you to make a decision about how many of those you want to keep versus how many of them you might want to recycle, for example, or give away to someone. So these are various questions that you can use. I'm going to actually hold off in terms of time with this exercise, but one of the things that I'm doing this exercise, right now, but one of the things that you can do is to look at picking an item that would be moderately difficult for you to part with, rating on a scale from 0 to 10 how distressed you expect that you would feel if you were to part with it, and how long you think that distress would last. And then to talk out loud for about 5 minutes all the different thoughts you have about parting with the item, reasons why not to, reasons to, just whatever the thoughts are that come to your mind. And then to make a decision on whether or not to part with the item. And then to act on the decision. And so if you made the decision to part with it, to rate your level of distress, and then to rate it again 10 minutes later, 30 minutes later, an hour later, a day later, a week later. And to ask yourself, what did I learn? Like, what's the takeaway from that? Because part of what oftentimes happens is people feel a significant amount of distress initially, and they anticipate that they're just going to stay feeling distressed. Distress, whether that's feeling a sense of loss and grief or feeling anxious. And one of the things that quite often people experience is that they either don't feel as distressed as they thought they would feel, or they do feel really distressed initially, but that distress does not last indefinitely, that they come to feel less distressed over time, which is really valuable to experience. Like if you don't part with something or part with any things in order to avoid that, you don't ever discover what actually happens and whether what actually happens is what, similar to or different from what you think is going to happen. So that can be a really valuable thing to experiment with, what we call, behavioral experiments. And then we also work with people around reducing acquiring. And so if we're going to be working on helping people to be, not acquiring as much, it's going to be important to also be increasing other kinds of pleasurable activities. And for a number of people, if you're at all like some of the other people that I have worked with, it may be that you don't do a lot of other things that are pleasurable, and it can be really helpful to be experimenting with some different possible things that you might enjoy. If you have difficulty coming up with things, you can look online and there's lots of lists of potentially pleasurable activities. I will have people oftentimes look at those lists and just make note of ones you might be willing to try. And so we want to be helping you to increase the amount of time that you're spending doing other kinds of things that you might come to enjoy. Also coming up with some rules for acquiring. So for example, I've worked with some people where I'm thinking about one person in particular who said, I can only go Christmas shopping if I go with my friend, because my friend knows that I have hoarding issues. And I'm less likely then to be buying a bunch of things that are really not going to help me about this issue. But I do want to get some gifts for some people in my life. And so this person's rule was I only go Christmas shopping if I'm going with my friend. And also it can be helpful to be doing what we call non-acquiring outings. So you're practicing non-acquiring, like going into stores and seeing things where you feel that tug of like, oh, I really like that. I really want to get that. And being able to pause and ask yourself some different questions and even get practice in leaving the store and not getting the item and asking yourself, like, what happens with that pull, that like strong feeling about wanting to get that item? Does it stay the same over time? Does it shift at all? Does it lessen? Does it stay about the same? What happens? And just like there were questions about parting with things, there are lots of questions you can ask yourself to help you make decisions about whether or not you want to acquire something in the first place. And these are some examples. I'm going to also, in the interest of time, not have us do this exercise about box breathing, but that's one tool that people can use. Lots of different breathing skills, and box breathing is one breathing exercise people can use. It's a way of helping to deal with sometimes, distressing feelings. And so you might practice this, like after this program. But basically what you do is you inhale to a count of 4, hold that for a count of 4, exhale for a count of 4, hold that for a count of 4. And then you repeat that. And so it forms a box. I'm going to have us quick run through these just in the interest of time, because I want people to be able to ask questions. Whoops, I went a little too far. These are just some helpful websites if people want to be able to look up some other information. IOCDF has a whole section of the website devoted specifically to hoarding, and that's a really good resource. I failed to say, and I'm kind of surprised that I failed to say this at the beginning because I usually do. This website, Children of Hoarders, I think a lot of people in the field, things have kind of shifted, and I think they probably, I don't know, maybe wish that they had called it something different at this point. Language matters. And I do not refer to anybody that I work with as being a hoarder. It's one of the things I encourage and usually talk about in trainings is to really think about the language that we're using. Most people with lived experience do not like that term, and I can understand why. For one, there's just a lot of stigma around this, but also we are not our condition. We might have a condition, like we might have hoarding disorder, or we might have difficulty with possessions, but we are far more, all of us, far more than any condition that we have. So it's really helpful to keep that in mind. And then the book that I was referring to, Buried in Treasures. And if anybody has questions after today, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to answer questions that people might have.